And we are live, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Rational Standard. I'm Martin van Staden. I am joined by David Ansara, and today we have a very a special episode compared to the usual format. A few weeks ago, we interviewed Joe Emilio about his new documentary, Stolen Ground. And today, we're very privileged to be able to interview Hermann Pretorius from the IRR on his new book, which I'm going to display here in just a second. Rule Breakers. Uh, all about what happened during the 2024 elections and the campaign that led up to it. This is available now since I think last week or so. Uh, I can only recommend everyone picking it up and understanding what the hell South Africa finds itself in today. So, without further ado, let me just allow Herman to say hi. Herman, what's up?
Hi, David, Martin, thank you very, very much for this opportunity. I must say, asking me to talk about the book is sort of like asking a grandmother to talk about her grandkids. You might have to sort of intervene at some point to say, yeah, we've heard enough. You don't have to tell us every time that they develop a new skill. But the good thing about a book is it's relatively static. Um, so yeah, no, it's a pleasure to be here. I thought it was a campaign worth chronicling in a way. And what I set out to do was to really give a good idea as to what the storyline of the campaign was, what moved public opinion, in what direction did it move, what caused various shifts in momentum. And I hope the book unpacks that, and I hope it helps readers to understand when they see political things happening, particularly in a build-up to an election. What are the forces at play? Why do some things seem to work and other things not?
Mm. Yeah, so let me get us started here on kind of, I think what I found very interesting. A few months ago, you explained the methodology, and it wasn't anything that I've kind of heard before as kind of how you can approach something like this. I found it very fascinating, and yeah, I think maybe explain to our audience how do you approach that, and then David, whenever you feel the need to kind of butt in, please do so. I am kind of the glorified host here, but jump in whenever you're ready. All right, thanks, everyone.
Cool. So yeah, no, I think it probably starts from the story of the book starts from a place of relative frustration. Now, for someone interested in politics in South Africa, perhaps that's not new. But in in an American election, and in a British election, and in Canadian, Australian elections, all those sort of other political landscapes that I follow and enjoy, there's an abundance of polling data. If you take the American elections over the last few weeks of an election campaign, only the last few weeks, you would get literally hundreds of opinion polls. You will have a very, very clear indication of who's up, who's down, and you'll be able to see, so that debate performance really had an impact. And so it's much easier to follow the contours and the development of the landscape in a polling rich environment. Now, in South Africa, whilst for the third world we are a relatively well polled country, um, we simply don't have the same depth of tracking public opinion as a place like America has. In the 5 years between 2019 and the start of the election campaign in about June 2023, South Africa saw about 44 opinion polls. Now that's not bad; it's decent, but it's very intermittent. It's not always quite at the spaced over sensible periods. So if you want to understand the ups and downs of a political campaign, you do need something to form sort of a proxy for opinion polling. And um, in June 2023, I started just gathering a lot of data about mentions of political parties, specific issues, policy issues, specific political leaders. And I just sort of downloaded this data and compiled it, and I didn't have a clear idea what I wanted to do with it, but I knew, or my suspicion was, that hidden within the data was something of a storyline that would be able to show you, when load shedding increases as a salient issue, and more people moan about it on social media, when more journalists write about it. And in a concept like load shedding, it's not just the word load shedding that you track. You must also think, what other keywords could be indicative of someone speaking about load shedding? You could have load shedding one word. You could have load shedding two words. You can have load shedding misspelled with one D, or with the A and the O switched around. You could have stage 4 or stage 5, but then that might, refer to, I don't know, some form of cancer or some competition. So you have to sort of build a bit of a keyword asset basis for these issues. And for a political party, if you think ANC, you don't just track ANC, you also track African National Congress, or Ramaphosa, or Cyril Ramaphosa, or Fikile, or Mbalula, or Fikile Mbalula. So you sort of go with the Patriotic Alliance. You would look at, their Abahambe is part of one of the campaign words that they use, and Ons Baizani. So for every party and issue, I started building this cluster of recognizable keywords. And so for the 15 issues I tracked, and for the 12 parties I tracked, each party and issue had about a 40-word keyword sample set of words. And as I started interpreting the data, I really didn't get very far in terms of figuring out, what am I seeing here, until I converted much of the data to percentages, where I started looking at, right, if on a day you have the DA getting 10 news mentions, getting 100 social media mentions, the ANC getting 70 news mentions and 10,000 social media mentions. Once I converted those into percentages to say that on a day, the ANC, as to the extent that political parties were mentioned on a specific day, the ANC got 43% of the mentions, and the DA got 18% of the mentions. And then, so relaying it to percentages really helped, because then I started to see patterns. I saw that when the ANC salience goes down in terms of not really being mentioned to the same extent in news media or on social media, you would see a corresponding dip in their support, based particularly on the social media, on the Social Research Foundation's tracking poll ahead of the election. And that became the seed of the whole idea of actually trying to build a system, a bit of a model that could use social media data, news media data as a proxy for polling. Now, every party has a unique little relationship it has with these forms of media. IFP vastly underrepresented on social media, EFF vastly overrepresented on social media, ANC overrepresented in news media, and the DA underrepresented on both forms of media. So the moment you get to that point of understanding that each party has a specific relationship with a form of media, and you sort of apply some polynomial regression line fitting to it, what I ended up was with the model that I use in the book called the Public Presence Support Level Model, in short PPSL. And I trained it over a period of weeks, and then with the final election results in, just after election day last year, I gave it a year's worth of media data, no polling data input. So I didn't give it an idea of, at this point in the campaign, the ANC was at this level, or the DA had that one. I just gave it a start point, which was essentially what I calculated each party's position to be based on polling around June 2023. And I gave it the data of a year and said, what new model having been built now with the various relations of the media built in for each party, what would the result be according to you on the 29th of May 2024? And this is where it got exciting. For the ACDP, my PPSL predicted a result of 0.5%. They got an actual result of 0.6%. For the ANC, my PPSL model predicted 41.1%. They got 40.2. For Action SA, 1.8. They got 1.2. For Borsa, 1.9, they 0.9, they got 0.4. For the DA 21.4, they got 21.8. For the EFF 9, they got 9.5. For the Freedom Front Plus 1.2, they got 1.4. IFP 3.7, they got 3.9. MK 13.9, they got 14.6. PA 2.2, they got 2. Rise and Zanzi 1, they got 0.4. That's the one I was furthest out with. And UDM 0.3, they got 0.5. So the fact that those results really closely resembled the state of play on election day, and the fact that I could use the Social Research Foundation's tracking to sort of see, yes, my lines are doing a similar thing, not perfect, but quite similar. That was enough for me to say, look, it might not be perfect, but it gives us a good idea as to when parties moved up, when they moved down. And if we can time those moments of upward or downward momentum being triggered, and we coordinate it with issues rising or falling in salience, we could start mapping out what happened at what point from June 2023 to June 2024 that moved us towards this extraordinary result. ANC plummeting below 50, the PA raising its support levels from 2019 by almost 5,000%. And that then became the basis of the book, is to look at when we saw big shifts, which months, what was happening at that time, and then interpret, right, if the IFP got momentum here, what triggered it? And that became the basis of understanding when parties gained momentum, when they lost it, and why.
Yeah, I just want to say well done on publishing the book, Hermann. Unfortunately, I haven't read it yet, but it's on my to-buy list. So you should remind our audience and me about where we can get the book. So I'm keen to get stuck in. And yeah, so I mean, I guess one of the challenges with South African politics is, like you said, there's kind of uneven distribution of platforms. So the campaigning is happening almost in different parallel streams. So MK seemed like it had quite a lot of on the ground kind of troops, some kind of former ANC structures that basically flipped, and then there was a lot of kind of campaigning in the rural areas, whereas, like you said, EFF very heavily on social media, but not really on the ground that much. So how do you sort of standardize these different signals that are coming in? Because how do you know that you're matching like with like if you're getting, say, higher social media sentiment versus traditional sentiment versus on the ground kind of, and how do you even measure the on the ground kind of activity?
So that's where the premise sort of it's sort of the willing suspension of disbelief in a way, that I used Google search trends. I looked at Facebook media, X or Twitter media, YouTube comments, and Reddit comments. That was the basis of my social media gathering. So the idea of this methodology is that it's the closest you can come to listening to the interest of people. And what was very, very interesting is that across these platforms, from Google to X to Facebook to YouTube, you really saw the same patterns. If you saw a spike in Google searches, for example, for the EFF, and you went and looked at Facebook and at X and YouTube comments, you see a corresponding spike. I applied with Meta to gain access to their data library, and sort of it was a tense process because I wasn't sure I was going to get it at the end of the day, but I did, and it was very useful because then I could see in their anonymized data that there was definitely pickup of parties and issues at specific times. And then there was also just the application of the good old smell test. Are we as someone who's been following political campaigns for 10 years and being in the professional analytical business for 5, I just also needed to check, does this make sense? Am I looking at something that makes sense? For example, my data showed that in July, towards the end of July, beginning of August, the EFF jumped to about 20% support, rivaling for at least 2 days the DA for the second largest party in the country. And that might sound quite absurd on the face of it. I mean, 20%, they ended up getting less than 10. But if you look deeply enough, you see that at that time, Ipsos had a poll in the field that they only published later that found the EFF to be within 1 point of the DA in the high teens. At the time, what was going on was the EFF's 10th birthday celebrations. Big spending, the ability to fill Soweto Stadium with 90,000 people. So the fact that the EFF at that moment got momentum makes sense, and that my model showed it makes sense. But what made even more sense was the fact that if I compared the EFF gaining momentum in July 2023 to where the other parties were, the DA didn't lose momentum, the ANC did. So there seems to have been a bit of a transfer of people willing to vote for the ANC and the EFF. At that point, the EFF seemed to have their interest, their loyalty more than the ANC did. And the same then applied when MK got onto the scene, where I would see that shift away from ANC and EFF towards MK. And what became a pattern was that there was the 65 to 68% block of ANC, EFF, MK voters, and the battle between those three parties really centered on a 10% block within that 60 that swung from one to the other. And when the ANC gained in that 10% block, it was almost always at the expense of EFF and MK. And as we know, by the end of the campaign, the data showed MK to be securing that 10%. That sort of swing block almost universally swung in behind MK by the end of the campaign. That's what my data showed. And it passes the smell test in terms of where these voters might come from, and knowing that the MK at the end of the day had a barnstorming performance. So it was a combination of these things, but I have to be honest about the fact that there is an assumption here that the model is useful. And I'm honest about it in the sense that my frustration with political analysis quite often is it makes medieval entrail reading look scientific. It's quite often just, the public thinks this. And my attempt was to get a step beyond that. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But is it perhaps a step in the direction of having a bit more of a feel for grassroots? I think it is the case, because at the end of the day, despite the fact that social media isn't the be all and end all of cut through in terms of media access, what I did find that it was a good enough proxy to be able to give one an idea of, who's winning, who's losing. And the fact that the results were pretty convincing by the end really gave me the green light to say, perfect it isn't, perfectly scientific it might not be. But I think there's something there enough to form an idea of when what moved who in which direction.
So I've just brought up the IEC results dashboard from the election. And I mean, just on the question of the swings in the final analysis, I mean, if you look at the DA's performance historically, they got 21.81% in 24. 2019 was a bit of a dip, 20.7, and then that was down from 22 in 2014. The ANC's kind of been on this rather kind of steady decline that then dramatically accelerated in 2024. So, I mean, when we look at the big picture, I mean, the EFF didn't really change that much. I mean, they were on this positive trajectory, and that got interrupted slightly. But I mean, they've gone backwards, but not significantly. So isn't really the big story of the election was just that the MK bit a huge chunk out of ANC? Is that as simple as it was, or was there more going on?
Well, I identify the two standout parties of the two most successful parties of the campaign as MK and the Patriotic Alliance. Undoubtedly, MK having a first round performance as a party that really started existing formally in September 2023 and sort of actually became a party in December 2023. To go from a standing start a few months away from the election to getting, in the mid-teens is an astonishing achievement. And for the Patriotic Alliance to grow its support by almost 5,000%, I mean, that's astonishing. So what I gain from that is that the reason and I mentioned this in the book as well, party sources within the DA really said that for Staden to have a survivable outcome, about a year out from voting day, it was that the DA needed to get 23%. And as the election went on and the DA internally started really feeling the pressure of the PA, that expectation adjusted to being, all right, 23% is perhaps a bit of a stretch. PA is eating too much of DA support, particularly in the Western Cape and part of Gauteng. So an improvement on the 2019 result would be the baseline for survival. And that's, at the end of the day, what happened, what allowed Staden to sort of go into the GNU negotiations with relative job certainty, is he had done just enough, because even within the DA, the realization, even from anti-Staden people in the DA, the feeling was that the PA was significant enough of a threat that merely neutralizing it so that it doesn't wipe out any advance for the DA to do better than 2019 would be good enough. So for MK, of course, they took massive chunk out of the ANC. But what's interesting is why that happened from a campaigning perspective. And the heart of it, actually, I find, is that the ANC simply never figured out what to do about the threat of MK. They couldn't be strategically responsive enough, and they were sort of hindered by these two possible routes to take. Either they could take a very aggressive path to, really take shots at Zuma and MK, and there would have been historical precedent for that. They did that with the UDM from 1998 to 1999, when the UDM was identified by the internal documents in 98 as the most significant threat to the ANC in the Eastern Cape. And then they launched a vicious campaign aimed almost squarely at discrediting Bantu Holomisa along racial lines, saying he's a sellout for going over and working with Rolf Meyer. He was, it was really an ugly campaign, the 1999 campaign in the Eastern Cape, really racial invective used. But the blueprint of that sort of aggression, of breaking down your opponent, they didn't take that route for two reasons against MK. Number one, where Holomisa established his party about 407 days away from an election, even more, 700 days away from an election in 1997, MK really got onto the scene only in December 2023, so 6 months versus 2 years. The UDM established itself almost too early, became a target, and then gave the ANC the basis for over 2 years, just discrediting Holomisa specifically. Zuma didn't give them that time. He didn't give them the build-up. He just, jumped onto the scene, and that's a failure of immense, catastrophic political intelligence for the ANC. This is a party that knew, in the arguments in court, they said they knew about MK developing as early as May 2023, and only acted against the party's name, against the party's emblems, and so on, after December 2023. And Dali Mpofu, in acting for MK, pointed this out very effectively in the court cases, saying this is a political case. This is a matter. The ANC is now scrambling towards to the courts to stop something only after Jacob Zuma joined to make MK a threat to the ANC's interests. And the court seemed to buy that argument because they didn't give the ANC their way in critical instances, like with the name and the emblem. So the first thing is MK was left unaffected by an aggressive UDM 1998-99 style campaign. The other thing that made that difficult is polling from the SRF that showed in KwaZulu-Natal, Zuma was double as popular as Ramaphosa. So they couldn't take an aggressive approach to Zuma because that might actually harm them. So in the end, they couldn't go the aggressive route, but they also didn't go the sort of embracing route. They settled for something in the middle. And at the end of the day, that wasn't convincing. A notable moment towards March 2024 came when Thabo Mbeki became involved in the campaign, visibly for the first time in about 10 years for the ANC at a UNISA event. He attacked MK quite horribly and quite viciously, and made perhaps some valid points. But the problem that Mbeki ran into was that he was only rehashing arguments that clearly hadn't dented Zuma's very enthusiastic base of support. So by the end of the campaign, the ANC never had an answer to MK. They didn't risk going hard enough. Zuma didn't give him the time. His standing in KwaZulu-Natal didn't give them the opportunity, nor did they seek to reconcile. They sort of fell between the cracks. And interestingly, in a very sort of poetic moment, the first time that Zuma and MK was denied the sort of impact that they had up to voting day was at the announcement of the results, when ANC officials met very briefly and privately with IEC officials at the voting center when Ramaphosa was about to receive the results from the IEC. And it was decided that Zuma is about to come late. It's clear that he wants to come late. He must not be allowed into the building. And he wasn't allowed to disrupt Ramaphosa. He wasn't allowed to be dramatic and intrusive and an insurgent force. So in a weird poetic way, just locking Zuma out was probably what the ANC should have done from the start, because the only time in this book that they really got one up on Zuma, on MK, was when they just locked him out in a physical sense. MK might have won the election but lost the peace, where the ANC lost the election but sort of won the peace in the negotiation. So yeah, MK took a chunk out, but the interesting story is why they managed it, why the ANC allowed it to happen.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting. I mean, for those of us who kind of have a values-based approach to politics, it's actually quite disheartening, but it's very important to understand how these things work. But I mean, the other aspect, and you kind of during your discussion on the methodology, what struck me is the question of kind of I guess there's a few questions here. I guess what comes first? Is it a real sincere public opinion that kind of bubbles onto social media, and then the news media kind of picks up on that and runs with it? Or the other alternative is kind of journalists and intellectuals and thought leaders kind of, they decide what the news agenda is, and then social media sees what the news is talking about, and then that filters into social media, and that kind of leads I guess think about the EFF rally. Was that a groundswell of public opinion thinking, wow, we saw some pictures about the EFF rally on Twitter and that looks very exciting, I think I'll vote for them? for like a few days. That's like the idea that people have. So kind of on that first point, what comes first, or is that not clear? Is it kind of a hodgepodge of these things happening? And then I guess the follow on from that is there causation? I don't know if necessarily that you'll know this, but is there causation, do you think, between what it seems the social and news media is interested in and then how people vote? Or is it how people wanted to vote that is kind of informing the media cycle? Because why I'm thinking of this is, can you contrive an election victory? Is kind of what I'm what's filtering in the back of my mind. Can you take 500 million rand, or geez, okay, let's take a few billion, 10 billion rand, and just throw it at a media campaign? I know some of these small parties tried that, didn't work, but you throw a lot of money at a media campaign, you blow up on social media, on news media, and then you end up winning the election. That's kind of what's bubbling in the back of my mind. But your insights on this would be much appreciated.
So whether news media follows social media or social media follows news media, it really varies. Sometimes I would see a story starting on social media getting picked up by news media, but many other times it would be the reverse. So it's not a hard and fast rule of who sets the agenda and who follows it. In the past, especially, if you look at the agenda setting theory, of news media being sort of what's interesting to news media is what becomes interesting to the public. Very much a pre-social media theory. It still bears some weight because coverage in news media does tend to give a level of credence and credibility that often spills over into social media. But it's not a hard and fast rule as to who responds to whom. And can a party just, blanket with news media? I would, or with social media ads and so on. I would say no. And I think there are two parties that indicate this quite clearly, and that the first is the EFF. They maintained a disproportionate presence on social media throughout. And in terms of being able to spend money in one of the media spheres, it's quite easy to do it in the social media sphere. It's quite a lot harder to do it convincingly in the news media sphere. And when you look at the moments that the EFF gained momentum, it wasn't necessarily the moments when it was clear that money was being spent or an issue was necessarily being driven. Rather, it was, for example, one of the best runs that the party had was in October 2023, when Busisiwe Mkhwebane, the former public protector, became an EFF MP at the same time as the EFF surprising in two critical by-elections at the time. Not typically stuff you would associate with a pickup in momentum, but it was clear that if you can purchase real estate through a stunt like having Busisiwe Mkhwebane join your parliamentary team, being the embodiment of the party's narrative of, sort of black excellence being suppressed by white monopoly capital and the capitalist forces and the sellouts in the ANC, if you've got such a powerful manifestation of your narrative, you really get the opportunity to earn public real estate in terms of salience that really one wouldn't think of buying necessarily. So the other point that why I think the EFF performed badly or sort of went backwards in terms of support for the first time, despite the ANC losing and despite them being, at least before MK, the anticipated beneficiary of ANC vote collapse, is for all the pomp and glamour and circumstance of the Soccer City FNB Stadium celebrations, Malema being raised on a platform on high, what didn't quite get reported as much as might be useful is that Malema shortly afterwards fired about 400 elected representatives, members of provincial legislatures, councillors, people who, according to the EFF top command, didn't ensure attendance to the required numbers at the EFF celebration events. Now, what often gets missed is the fact that politics is actually most of the time quite mundane, in the sense that at the best, a political representative like a councillor is someone not necessarily with any other skills than a network, a sort of a Rolodex that you can bring to the party. And having spent some time in sort of within the party structures as a party staffer, you get to understand that what really matters for party logistics is that little Rolodex. Does someone know a local printer who can on short notice print 500 pamphlets or 30 posters? Does someone know perhaps a local teacher or a local principal or school who can, has 100 spare pens that we can use for the voter registration drive? Is there someone that perhaps knows a butcher or a baker in the area that can supply the broodjies or the boerewors rolls at short notice for the event? Do we have a good relationship with the party with the same party office in the neighboring constituency that we could perhaps borrow their gazebo so that we can have a registration tent here? All of these mundanities really boil down to human resources and human capital. Those sort of on the ground level solutions quite often get missed in politics. If Malema or Steenhuisen or Ramaphosa need to give a speech in a particular place or town, it's up to the party in that place or town to organize it. That means they must solve very silly and simple problems, but many of them. Do we have speakers? What if there's load shedding? Do we have water for the activists? And by firing about 400 elected representatives, Malema undermined his party's ability to do the mundane footwork of an election campaign. So in the end, that decision probably cost them significantly, because the Rolodex, the simple solutions, the shorthand, if you go look at, for example, the registration day presences, that it didn't make it in the book because it wasn't notable in shifting public opinion. But if you go look at photos and the very, very minimal news reporting there is of registration weekends, quite often you would see the EFF's little stations being undermanned or being relatively shoddy, which is indicative of a party that had sort of fired human capital at an inopportune moment. And in the end, I think the third thing is the EFF had, I can't remember, I think it might have been 13 moments of positive momentum throughout the campaign. All of them happened when it wasn't a Malema show, when it was about the EFF in a larger scope. Busisiwe Mkhwebane joining the party celebrating its 10-year anniversary or 10th birthday. So there's an element there that Malema himself might have overstayed his political welcome. So all that said, despite having a very strong social media game, despite having a very loyal social media presence, if they had spent money on a campaign on social media, it wouldn't have fixed the underlying problems that I think caused the EFF to lose momentum, caused the EFF to not be the formidable insurgent party that they were. Also, they were dealing with the fact that Malema was essentially a Zuma tribute act, and then suddenly Elvis was on tour again, and no one wanted to see the imitation. But buying an election campaign, I don't think is that feasible. And the other example is, of course, Rise and Mzansi. Media-wise, incredibly polished, well-funded. If you were a PR analysis and only looking at who had the most polished election events and campaigns events, you would probably be somewhere between the DA and Rise and Mzansi. And yet, Rise and Mzansi's ambition of winning 7% of the vote simply didn't materialize. So to an extent, yes, of course, you could purchase some real estate, but the narrative forming forces sort of go wider than just do you get mentioned more, and can you buy the loyalty or the salience of the public?
Yeah, David, do you have something to? Yeah, so something that I find quite interesting, and I don't know the answer to this. I suspect I have an answer to it, but I think you have the data. What were the election issues that the election was ultimately decided on, putting aside personality, putting aside network, and putting aside government performance? So could you detect certain issues of substance, maybe policy, that even to a limited extent shifted the vote in a meaningful way? Yes or no? And maybe if no, what would that mean that something like an election manifesto and kind of these value statements that all the parties put out don't really matter in South African elections? What would what do your data say about something like that?
So let me give the example of MK. On the day that they launched their manifesto, my best estimate is that they were already at 12% nationally. Between launching the manifesto and election day, they only added 2 and a bit percent. So to conclude that the MK manifesto really didn't matter, I think, would be fair. So to the extent that manifestos are vote winners, I think not. But that doesn't mean that it is unimportant, because I think at the end of the day, a manifesto is almost more valuable to the party internally than it is as a sales mechanism to the outside. My firm conviction from everything I've read and seen is that you start at ideology and convictions. That goes over into policy. Policy goes over into actions. Actions go over into message, and message goes over into salience. So it's difficult to get to salience if you don't have convictions and policy. But at the end of the day, people don't walk into the voting booth with manifestos. They walk into the voting booth essentially with salience, and that sort of old cliche of people don't remember what you say, people remember how you make them feel, as horrible as that is, it's very true. Because at the end of the day, if you look at questions around the world in polling, that is the best predictor of successful election campaigns. It is parties that either win or positively change their share of an affirmative answer in terms of the question, cares about people like me. If you are a party that can, or a candidate that can convince the public, or enough of the public, that you care about people like me, the ordinary, you're golden. That's where a party really wants to play an election game, and manifestos help with that. They form the sort of the germ of that vibe. The germ of that salience is, at the end of the day, it's parked in that space of a manifesto. And when you look at the parties that achieved manifesto momentum, none of those momentums really lasted. So it's not that manifestos in and of themselves have gear changes that sort of takes the party from idling at this level to idling at that level, but it is the first in a sequence of things to get to the question of cares about people like me, yes or no. But in terms of issues, it's quite interesting on load shedding. The salience of load shedding is a very good example of seeing how over a year's time, from May 2023 to election day 2024, it really gradually declines, and you can almost plot that and map that perfectly onto load shedding itself, because 2022, worst year ever for load shedding for South Africa. By the 9th of May 2023, just a year, over a year before voting day, load shedding was a massive priority on my sort of heat map of issues. It was bright red. But then as the election campaign improved, with one or two spikes when you see it staged, it really declined as an issue. So by the time of the election, if I look here at my dashboard or my heat map, let me quickly just scroll to right before the elections. The issues that were rich in momentum were education was important, housing to a degree, illegal immigration, quite hot, and poverty gained sort of momentum towards the voting day. But that shouldn't mislead us to think that those are the bases on which people made their decision to vote. Because if I look at the data, by the beginning of April, to my mind, people had already decided who to vote for. April and May saw very minor shifts in terms of support and public momentum towards actual voting day. The stance of the race, or the state of the race at the beginning of April, without some noise up and down, very similar to the state of the race on election day. So while some issues gain momentum into voting day, it's not necessarily to be deducted that people voted on those issues.
I mean, one of the data points that was much discussed was the signing of the NHI Act by the president on the 15th of May. And the Social Research Foundation tracker showed a clear dip from that point. And that was often attributed as, a turning point in the election. But I mean, in terms of the public discourse, it didn't really seem to be something that was animating much discussion. I mean, I think people were quite surprised that the president went ahead and signed it. And the view was, well, this is kind of blown up in his face because he thought it was a populist act, but actually, maybe the electorate is a bit more conservative and they're aspirational and they actually like the idea of having world-class private healthcare. What do you think about that particular issue?
So I'm not going to argue with the Social Research Foundation. I think I know France well enough to understand when I might be on the losing side. But I do agree with. I mean, my data also shows. My data is a bit different from the SRF in that regard. My data shows a slight increase for the ANC for a day or two after the signing, and then the collapse from mid-40s to 40%. So this SRF's tracking data is a bit more immediate from the 15th of May, the signing of the thing. So mine perhaps has a bit of a lagging indicator. Just there at the highest point of that ANC line, there on the 12th or the 13th of May. On the 13th of May, it's announced that Ramaphosa will sign it on the 15th of May, and on the 15th of May, he signs it. Now, that had an impact on health as an issue in terms of salience. It went from about 3% to about 5%. So that's not a negligible rise. But what was interesting about that particular moment is what I think the SRF's data doesn't quite show, is that on the 5th of May, the DA published that flag burning ad, and it really started dominating the discussion. I spoke to people in the DA's campaign team at the time, and they were incredibly pleased because the point of the ad was, in the end, to hijack the public real estate space, to get people to talk about it, because if they're talking about you, they're not talking about anyone else. And what's interesting is that the signing of the NHI interrupted the DA's momentum from that ad. So from the 5th of May to the 15th of May, the DA was inching upwards in my data from about 22% to 26%. And then then it was announced they were signing, and they fell back towards 22%. So in a way, the president did use the presidential pen to manipulate the race. At the end, it didn't really benefit the ANC. They didn't win support from it, but they certainly did stop what public salience momentum there was on the DA's side. And we quite often are bombarded with this idea that racism really is the animating issue, the be-all and end-all of politics. But what's quite interesting is that we had very, very few racist spikes, and only two are worth mentioning. Number one is when the presidential plane was embargoed at the Polish airport in the Krakow airport, I think the Chopin airport, or Warsaw, Warsaw. When Wally Roeder blamed racism and said, "Oh, this is all racism. The president's life is being put in jeopardy by Polish racism." That was the one spike. And the other spike was when Malema sang Kill the Boer in late July, early August. And it is quite pleasing in a way to think that one of the two spikes in racism being important in the country didn't even happen in the country. So in terms of issues driving the momentum, an issue that people might miss is water. Water had quite a few important moments throughout the campaign. In the Pretoria area, there was the cholera outbreak, big discussions around that. Throughout October, there was effectively a full-blown water crisis in Johannesburg that was visible in the data. So the interest when it comes to issues is really when you see party momentum and issue momentum change at the same time, because then you can say, this party is either succeeding on this issue or failing on this issue. And that was actually, to depress Martin a bit further, that was actually quite rare to see coordinated full-on spikes between this party and this issue. Didn't quite happen, and I've been monitoring ever since, and recently I saw a very clear spike in corruption and DA salience at the same time, showing that the DA is really driving the issue of corruption as a point of public purpose, public discussion. But throughout the campaign, it wasn't quite as clear cut. And perhaps a good example of that is, again, the PA, because the PA gained momentum on three topics: Israel, illegal immigration, and effectively colored nationalism. And on the face of it, one might think, what do those things have in common? But if you go listen to Mackenzie's speeches and you go read some of his stuff and you try to really dig into what the PA was saying, what becomes clear to my mind is that these three policy areas of illegal immigration, Israel, and colored nationalism are connected in a displacement narrative. That illegal immigration is a risk to South Africa because it displaces South Africans from their just place in South Africa. If you don't get a job, you've been displaced from it by an illegal immigrant, beds in hospitals, places in schools. So illegal immigration is sort of driven by this fear of displacement. Israel is essentially a narrative about opposing displacement. And colored nationalism, given the history of being treated by both apartheid and ANC governments as, displaceable, has a very, very intrinsic connection to the sphere of being moved out of a community which is justly home. So the PA's narrative, and it was culminated almost poetically in Gate Mackenzie's final campaign speech, was this idea of, in the PA, you have a party that will not allow you to be displaced. And if you see the issue of Israel not necessarily as something that animates voters, but that triggers a values response that is quite primal to the audience being addressed, particularly by the PA, it becomes clear that issues in and of themselves are not the drivers of support, but they have a value connection to what a voter thinks is important. And what the PA and the MK did better than any other party is they had a tribe. They knew to whom they were speaking, and they made sure that whatever was happening around them gave them the opportunity to reinforce a very particular message to a very particular audience. And none of the other parties had that ability to identify a tribe. It doesn't need to be ethnic, but to identify the us, who the us is in the mindset of an us versus them. The MK and PA had what one could call in German a Gesellschaftsvertrag. They had a pact of community, and that allowed them just to be on message more, to use circumstances better, because they had that clarity where other parties simply lacked it.
Yeah, so today is Nelson Mandela Day, Herman, and I think this was a popular narrative, at least for like when I was growing up, this idea that many people still vote for the ANC based on that Mandela promise that kind of he's the elder statesman who led South Africa out of apartheid, and your book's title is Rule Breakers, and I want you to get into that, but I do think it speaks appropriately to the 2024 election being some kind of I would say maybe the end of an era. It's the end of ANC absolute dominance over parliament, at least, and the beginning of maybe our coalition or our fractured political era. So I guess what would be your sense of can we say that currency, that Mandela currency, is there still some of it left in the ANC's bank? Is there still some of it left in the broader National Democratic Movement, ANC, EFF, MK's bank? Or could one say that South African politics has basically now moved on from that? Which, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think if that is the case, it could be that we're just maturely maybe starting to look a little bit more forward. But yeah, I mean, I think to mark the occasion of Nelson Mandela Day, it would be good to just maybe dive into that and whether the presence of Nelson Mandela, or at least the vibe, the Nelson Mandela vibe, kind of is still lingering somewhere in the background. What would be your sense on that?
So, from analyzing the ANC's campaign, I make a few recommendations in terms of weaknesses, and one of the weaknesses they ran into was that they didn't adapt their campaign to Ramaphosa. The ANC's campaign approach to how a leader operates within an election campaign has been consistent from Mandela, Mbeki, Zuma, Ramaphosa, and that's just politically stupid because leaders differ. They look good under different circumstances. But what the ANC forced Ramaphosa to be is something that he wasn't very good at. He couldn't drive a rally like Zuma. He couldn't deliver prosaic speeches like Mbeki, and he couldn't command public affection like Mandela. And yet they used him as if he could do all of those things still. So in terms of the Mandela dividend for the ANC, I do think that if it isn't spent already, it will be spent when Ramaphosa goes, because I do think he is the last leader, generationally speaking, that could claim to be an inheritor or a direct apostle from the messianic Madiba. Because if you think about it, it's quite worrying. For the ANC, their previous three leaders, Mbeki, or the three leaders, this one and the previous two, Mbeki, Zuma, and Ramaphosa were all born within 10 years of each. They were born within a 10-year window, and yet they've been in control of the party for 25. So the fact that the ANC has run out of a struggle generation, or a generation proximate enough to the struggle to claim the Mandela mantle, really weakens that currency. But I think it's worth perhaps reading on this point from the book in the final chapter, where or the penultimate chapter, reflecting on the campaign, is where I say that Ramaphosa should have been deployed as a campaign asset in a wholly different way. The ANC leader has never been good on his feet, yet he has always been likable and an impressive statesman. The BRICS gathering he hosted should have been one of many such presidential events that could have been rationally justified as in the national interest and also utilized by the ANC for its political gain. When the ANC did try to use the presidency to its political advantage, it did so in such a rushed and transparent fashion with the NHI that, far from elevating Ramaphosa's standing as president and party leader, it weakened his standing as head of state. If you look at when Ramaphosa has polled well personally, it was when he was more associated with being national leader than party leader. He's always been more popular than his party. So whenever he was when he was Ramaphosa of the ANC, he was a weak political asset. But when he was Ramaphosa, the president, the father of the nation, the Mandela type national figure, he was at his best in terms of earning political capital for the ANC. So the Mandela lessons of that nostalgia, I think, could have been used by the ANC, and in fact, I wrote a little memo in terms of, if I were the ANC, what should their message have been, and it would have been something like this: in summary, the message that emerges most naturally from deliberate consideration of the ANC's strength and moments of strength on the campaign centers on one word: renewal. As a theme, it had served Ramaphosa well on his elevation to the union buildings, and it offered a route to credible messaging that could have made the most of the ANC's political strengths. An effective ANC message would have looked something like this: South Africa's renewal is at hand, and a renewed ANC is ready to lead. Only Cyril Ramaphosa has the credibility, the experience, stature, and integrity to lead a collective renewal of South Africa. A GNU with a mission to renew the South African promise that we can work together and build together. And one of the points I make is that it was so blindingly obvious that a multi-party government was the likely outcome of this, that it is insane that the ANC never took ownership of that idea to steer it from the start and endorse it and embrace it and say, Ramaphosa is a consensus builder, Mandela was a consensus builder, it's that legacy living on. Ramaphosa led the collaborative constitutional renewal of our country as we moved on from apartheid, and he is winning the fight for renewal in the ANC. Only Cyril Ramaphosa has brought together people in labor, government, and business in the renewal of the ANC to build and to renew. Unlike Cyril Ramaphosa, others have divided and sold out the ANC and South Africa to corrupt capturers. Only renewal can put the failures of the past behind us. Only a renewed ANC has the size, experience, legacy, and community reach to lead a renewal of South Africa that returns our country to the type of job creation the ANC led before the MK forces took control of Mandela's party and sold it to the Guptas and the moneyed interests. And then I crucially say, is this holistic message objectively and factually true or merited given the extensive failures of the ANC government under Ramaphosa? No. But that wouldn't have been the point. A campaign built on this message would have allowed the ANC to play to its strengths, as opposed to the campaign that was haphazard, unfocused, and ultimately led the party to scraping a result just above 40%. I think the last campaign in which Mandela magic might have been sprinkled was the 2024 one, and the ANC just missed it. And I think that's one of the rules that got broken. You ask about the title Rule Breakers. Number one, the rule of the ANC was broken. but also the rules about politics have also been broken. And also that we had very identifiable rule breakers. You've got Ramaphosa, 783 charges of corruption and so on, an incarcerated man. You've got Gayton McKenzie, a former incarcerated man. Clearly, they were both rule breakers in their own way, and they were the big winners of the election. And then you've got the rule breakers of... Yes, well, I thought that might be a bit bold. But then you've also got the rule breakers of due to collaborative politics. And I write in the final chapter of the book, campaign messaging will never be the same again. The illusion of a small party not being potentially a member of government is gone. You can very well imagine a future ANC leader being asked about KwaZulu-Natal federalism, or a DA leader being asked about the ACDP stance on abortion and whether that's a deal breaker for the ACDP leader to be a minister in a DA-led cabinet. So that rule of a party only having to speak about itself, and this idea that you've got a unitary government, it's either this or that, that rule's also gone. Credibility about what is an effective and a believable message on a campaign trail has changed forever. So yeah, that's where rules were broken by rule breakers, and fundamentally the ANC's rule was broken. So yeah, that's the title of it, and perhaps a rule I should have added is the rule that Mandela magic worked in the favor of the ANC was also broken, because they just didn't sprinkle the magic dust in a way that would have actually mattered, actually helped them.
Yeah, I mean, there's an interesting point you made there about that Ramaphosa, Zuma, and Mbeki, you said, were all kind of born within 10 years. I think Zuma and Mbeki were born within 10 days of each other. So they've almost been blood brothers in a way. But in some respects, they all represent quite radically different traditions. I mean, Mandela was obviously from the Robben Islander group of the ANC, and Mbeki and Zuma were the exile ANC under Oliver Tambo. But then Ramaphosa was kind of UDF ANC. He was a local boy. He never left the country. He wasn't in exile, and he wasn't in Robben Island. But I think he did miss an opportunity to sprinkle some of that Madiba magic fairy dust onto his campaign, because I mean, you could have really leaned into it, showing pictures of him. I think isn't it him who's holding Mandela's fist aloft outside of Victor Verster prison, or maybe he's holding the speech. This could be kind of Stalin-esque revisionist history here that I'm falling prey to. But he kind of seems to appear next to Madiba quite a lot. But I mean, in some ways, I guess your PR can only take you so far. People are not fools. They've lived through the last kind of 7 or so years of Ramaphosa's ascendancy, and so they've tasted the real thing. And maybe the Madiba magic is notable by its absence, just generally in South Africa. I mean, I think like when people think about what is the positive legacy of Madiba, I think it's the statesmanship and also non-racialism, that he really embraced this idea of the kind of rainbow nationalism. And as your colleague Anthea Jeffrey has pointed out, I think he was a very shrewd manipulator of public opinion. And I don't think he was the kind of the saintly figure that he's been lionized to be. And the history of the transition is also soaked in blood. It was by no means a bloodless transition. But nevertheless, I mean, he did seem to sort of capture a national identity, and gestures like walking out onto Ellis Park Stadium with Francois Pienaar and lifting the William Webb Ellis Trophy aloft. Those are really powerful symbols. But I think it's very difficult to replicate some of that, even consciously. I mean, I've seen photographs of Cyril Ramaphosa lifting the William Webb Ellis Trophy, and it doesn't quite have the same effect,
Interestingly enough,
go for it.
there's on my October chapter ends with the ANC on a bit of a high, a very short-lived high, but it coincides perfectly with the World Cup win. And I saw a graphic this morning that tracked public sentiment and the World Cup win featured there in terms of market sentiment. So that moment perhaps wasn't powerful and it might have been a bit distasteful, but one of the few moments that the ANC towards the end of the campaign saw positive momentum was a moment, as you say, of Madiba magic, of Ramaphosa, the William Webb Ellis Trophy aloft. And I think that just reminds us again that voters and consumers are the same people. And consumers often make very weird decisions that I buy that shaving cream because it's at eye level on the aisle shelf, or I buy that make of chicken noodles because that's what my parents used to buy. We shouldn't overestimate the rationality of the consumer, and the consumer is also the voter. So many things play into the human decision of, is Mandela magic present or not? But I think what, adding to the statesman-like point of Mandela's legacy, to my mind, two things jump out. And that is, firstly, Tony Leon writes about how the 1994 result in KwaZulu-Natal was so contested, and that the ANC, NEC, and the ANC in the province really wanted to contest this and say, no, it wasn't free and fair. And Mandela sat and listened, and by the end of the meeting, he said, go back to KwaZulu-Natal and prepare our people there to lose. I will not have this election labeled as anything other than free and fair. And that takes some doing. I think, there's something quite noble about that statement. Go back to KwaZulu-Natal and prepare our people to lose. And the other thing that I think Mandela did brilliantly was serving only one term. Not just, I think, did he do a very important thing constitutionally, showing that the George Washington of South Africa could have been president for life, could have gone on for another term, because he was actually, he was what, 74? That's, that's practically youthful compared to today's American politics. And if you go by the regulations of the ANC Youth Wing, you might still be able to be a member at that age. But so that first living the constitutionalist limit of power was important, but in a more cynical and perhaps unplanned way, he ensured a factionalized ANC. He ensured that the top spot would always be contestable. There's no president for life in the ANC. There will always be forces scheming and dreaming their way to the top. So his statesmanship, to me, is perhaps exemplified in those two moments. The one, I think, objectively noble, the other one constitutionally quite useful, but cynically, as a non-ANC member, I laud him for ensuring that we have an ANC that will always fight for itself, because the top spot will be in play.
Yeah, and you mentioned Frans Cronje earlier, and one of France's points is to say that Madiba actually had this ruthless streak about him, that he would often override his colleagues, like you just explained. And maybe that's something kind of absent in Ramaphosa, although he does go and sign lots of pernicious legislation without consulting people and firing deputy ministers and so on. But it always kind of feels like a bit of an affectation when it comes to Ramaphosa. I think also with the Madiba legacy, I think there's a bit of a supply problem. I mean, there's an oversupply of Mandelism. I mean, I used to be very fond of, the little Hewlett's sugar packets that you get at coffee shops. They always had like really interesting, quirky quotes from different people. But now they've made every single quote a Mandela quote. Every single major city has a Mandela drive, or every banknote in your wallet is got a face of Mandela on it, and it's just I think kind of it's cheapened the brand a little bit, but that's just an aside.
But I think what's also part of that is I'm annoyed by it, because seeing Mandela as a real politician who could drive wedges, who could strategize, who could be tactical, enriches our appreciation of the guy, that he was truly a politician. He was unlike Louis Botha, who was, a father of the nation, a unifier and a reconciliator. Mandela played a political game, and he played it quite brilliantly. I think one of the most brilliant plays in South African politics the last 30 years was the sort of perverse Euclidean dynamic that Mandela introduced, that because the DP was opposed to the ANC and the ANC is opposed to apartheid, the DP must be pro-apartheid. That sort of triangle of perversion is something that the DA still struggles with 30 years later, that because they were opposite Mandela, they must have been pro-Verwoerd. Brilliant political maneuvering, brilliant political messaging. I mean, it's sad that we sort of reduce him to little other than a sort of an elderly Barney the dinosaur character.
Yeah, so Dorian in the chat, he says that on the majority of metrics, Ramaphosa is objectively the worst of the lot. So yeah, if you look at economic growth, unemployment, he's the only guy who implemented a drastic authoritarian lockdown on the whole of the economy in our society. So his state capture predecessor didn't go that far. But I also think, you mentioned Tony Leon, and if you read Tony's book, I think it was called Opposite Mandela. It's kind of interesting reflection. And one of the anecdotes he talks about is, when they were having a parliamentary debate, Mandela kind of was responding to some parliamentary questions from Leon. And he said, we don't have to take these questions from these Mickey Mouse parties, because the DP only had about 1.6% of the vote at that stage. And so Tony is very got the gift of the gab. He immediately responded and said, well, we might be a Mickey Mouse party, but yours is a goofy government. And
yes.
But then Tony had I think he had a bypass. He had a heart surgery. And whilst he was recovering in hospital, he hears a knock on the door, and he hears that famous voice coming from the other side of the door saying, Mickey, it's Goofy here. I've come to see you, And so I think that kind of, that mix of realpolitik, but then also the charm and the levity, I think was a pretty good combination.
Yeah.
And so the other story from Helen Zille's biography is she attended a premier's Lekotla. So I think it was all of the premiers. So when she was Western Cape Premier, they had a meeting with like a Bosparad kind of 2-day workshop over a weekend or something with all of the other premiers. And Zuma called her up beforehand and said, listen, I know that you're going to be the only non-ANC person there, but I just want you to know that you're going to be in good hands and we're going to look after you. And, and they were obviously fierce political rivals. And then during one of the breaks, they had a dinner function, and there was music playing, and everyone was kind of dancing, and Zuma ended up dancing with Zille and doing a proper ballroom dance and leading her and spinning her around and everything. And apparently everyone was there filming. I'd love to see that video footage. And he kind of confided in her, like, the reason I know how to dance is because I was this poor country bumpkin who, when I went to Durban in the 50s or whenever it was, I was very jealous of all of the sophisticated urban guys who would dance with the ladies, and so this was my attempt to try and get to know the ladies. And we all know Zuma has a fondness for
got to know the ladies.
but in a way that those kind of two anecdotes kind of humanize those politicians, whereas, like, I don't know what's Ramaphosa's kind of like he lost his iPad and he's kind of can't put his face mask on his mouth. So some people during COVID thought that was quite endearing. And then our colleague Gail says, I've hoped for years that the DA would tell the tale of two Helens, i.e. the story of the origins of the DA, it is unknown that Sisman was a lone white voice in Parliament fighting for everyone's rights. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
And I think what makes Ramaphosa different is there's also that incident on the campaign trail where he was in a township. It might have been Soweto, I'm not sure, can't remember now. And someone, a young lady, came up to him with some question about the security of tenure of her mother's RDP house, if I remember correctly. And there were some questions around it, and she asked Ramaphosa for help. And he said, I think you should get a lawyer. And that was probably one of the worst answers I think a politician has ever given in such a human setting. It wasn't a political debate. He didn't, witticism wouldn't have worked. All he needed to do was show humanity. All he needed to do was, that's terrible, please give me your details, I'll raise it with the minister. That's it. But he couldn't even do that. And it shows the extent to which Ramaphosa was a missed opportunity for the ANC as an asset. He was never supposed to be the hugger and kisser of babies. He could have been a good ANC electoral asset. They just, I don't know why, but they just never took the time to strategically adjust and understand that this is a president who, number one, I write in the book, he fights best when unopposed. And number two, when he looks presidential, just make him campaign from the steps of the Union buildings. But, perhaps luckily they didn't ask me beforehand.
Yeah, you might have delivered a big ANC bump in the polls. When I listened to your suggestion for the kind of ANC campaign strategy, I found myself thinking, "Wow, geez, that I might even vote for them." So, yeah, it's
If there are any political parties out there that are looking for a campaign strategist, he's on this call. So give
absolutely, yeah. So Herman, thank you for this. I think we're kind of we've given a pretty good overview of what I think readers might expect in the book, and I'm certainly gonna get my hands on it. And I would encourage everyone watching to also do so, because it's look, my view is that, and I know you and I disagree on this, but I don't think the ballot is South Africa's salvation. I think that there are other things that need to be done for the country to be rescued or saved. But at the very least, it is crucially important that people understand what is going on and why we are in the situation that we are. What are the forces at play? And I think your book kind of, especially this new methodology that you've kind of adopted, I think is potentially a new way that people can actually in real time see where South African politics is at. So thank you very much for that. I'm gonna give you a chance to give your final words, and perhaps just include in that where people can find the book, and where they can follow you, and some of the other work that you're potentially working on right now. And then after that, I will close us off.
Thanks, Martin. No, it's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it immensely. So the book, Rule Breaker: How the 2024 Election Campaign Changed South Africa Forever. You can find it on Takealot. You can find it at Exclusive Books, at Protea Books. You can order it. Graffiti Books has them, I think. So and I hate to say all good bookstores, because I tend to quite like bargain books, but I haven't seen it there yet. So in all loyal bookstores, but I know Exclusive Books have a few copies. They put in some orders. Feel free to follow me on X. I sort of occasionally post updates from the PPSL model and adjustments that I'm making to it, new additions to try and make it more accurate. And yeah, no, if you're interested in the biography of the campaign, less the the forces of policy and more, what sold and what worked and what didn't. Please feel free to read the book. I enjoyed writing it. And David, Martin, thank you very much for your time today. I must say that the hour and 24 minutes flew by, for me at least. Perhaps that same mercy doesn't apply to the audience, but we can only hope.
No, thank you very much. No, we made a point of making this a long form show, and we had about 20 people joining us in person. That's a nice little audience. So thank you to you, Hermann, for chatting to us about the book. Thank you to everyone for being here. I'm sure many more will be watching this over the weekend. And as always, we encourage you to please like this video, share it, subscribe to the Rational Standard podcast, click the bell icon to get updated on when we upload our new content. Head over to Substack. Rational Standard is primarily a written platform, so please go there and follow our Substack and restack our content there as well. And of course, please go to these bookstores and get your hands on Rule Breakers. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, have a good one, and sic semper tyrannis.